Okay, quick question. Who told you the Middle Ages were the Dark Ages? Because if you picture that era as mud, misery, everyone thinking the earth is flat, and peasants coughing artistically into the plague, I've got news. The Dark Ages is not a historical diagnosis. It's a label, a vibe, a marketing campaign. A centuries-long smear job that started with a dramatic Italian poet, and then got weaponized by people who really wanted you to think, wow, thank goodness we're not those idiots. And here's the twist. Some of the darkness was real. Empires collapsing, cities shrinking, trade routes breaking, raiders turning up like uninvited guests who also brought swords. But a huge part of it was later generations dunking on the past to make themselves look clever. So today we're going to crack open the mystery. Why were they called the Dark Ages and who started it? What was actually happening? And why do historians today wince a little every time someone says it? Because the darkest thing about the Dark Ages might be the story we were sold about them. Welcome to the Curiosity Diary. Grab a drink, this one's going to get spicy. First, a bit of groundwork. Because the Middle Ages is basically a 1,000-year period lumped together into one broad term. Roughly speaking, the Middle Ages in Europe run from about the 5th century to the 15th century. So from the fall of the Western Roman Empire-ish to the Renaissance-ish. Now, when people say Dark Ages, they usually mean the early Middle Ages, around the years 500 to 1000 CE. The bit after Rome's western half stops being Rome the way you imagine it. No more big central bureaucracy, fewer grand building projects, fewer Roman-style cities humming like machines. But some people use Dark Ages as if it covers the entire medieval period, including knights, castles, universities and cathedrals, which is like calling the entire 20th century the disco era. Fun, but wildly inaccurate. So let's rewind to the moment the lights were supposedly went out. Imagine you're a Roman official in the late 400s. Your whole life, the empire is the background hum of existence. Taxes collected, roads maintained, soldiers paid, grain shipped, laws stamped, paperwork, endless paperwork. Then slowly at first, the machine starts coughing. The Western Roman Empire doesn't vanish overnight like someone flicks a switch. It's more like a massive organization quietly stops renewing contracts. The army? Not paid properly. The roads? Less maintained. Local strongmen? Suddenly very confident. And the old Roman cities? Those dense interconnected hubs start to shrink. In parts of Western Europe, long distance trade becomes rarer. Coinage circulation drops in some regions. Urban life thins out. Not everywhere, not evenly, but enough that if you are used to Rome as a system, this feels like the world is unraveling. And when a system unravels, two things happen. Life gets more local, you depend more on whoever is nearby and powerful, and records get patchier, because bureaucracy is basically record keeping with a fancy hat. Which brings us to the first meaning of dark. Here's something people miss. Sometimes dark doesn't mean everyone was miserable. Sometimes it just means we don't have as many sources. Historians love written records. They're essentially gossip enthusiasts with footnotes. And for parts of early medieval Western Europe, compared to the Roman era, there's simply less surviving writing, fewer official documents, fewer big city archives, fewer authors whose work got copied 1,000 times. So it's dark in the sense of being harder to illuminate, like trying to reconstruct a family argument when you only have 3 text messages and one of them just says K. This is especially true for some regions after Rome. We have brilliant flashes, monks, chronicles, law codes, letters, but also big foggy stretches where archaeology has to do the heavy lifting. So yes, early medieval history can be dark because it's obscure, but obscure doesn't automatically mean stupid, savage, or stagnant. And that brings us to the other meaning of dark, the one that was absolutely not neutral. Because the phrase Dark Ages wasn't invented by some objective historian, it was invented by a man who basically looked at the previous centuries and said, ugh, the vibes were rancid. Meet Francesco Petrarca, also just known as Petrarch, 14th century Italian scholar, poet, humanist, and crucially a man with the spiritual energy of someone who would absolutely make a 3-hour playlist called Real Music Only. Petrarch adored classical Rome, the literature, the style, the swagger. He read ancient writers and felt inspired, and when he looked at the centuries between ancient Rome and his own time, he didn't see a complex evolving world. He saw a long slump, a cultural hangover. So he started describing the period after Rome as an age of darkness, not because people literally forgot how to make light, but because to him it lacked the intellectual sparkle of the classical authors he worshipped. It's a value judgment, a literary insult. A man standing in the Renaissance doorway going, everything before me? Mid. And here's the important bit. Petrarch wasn't talking about the Middle Ages the way we do. He was crafting a story, the golden age known as Rome, then into the dark in-between time, and now the rebirth with the Renaissance. Now here's where it snowballs. Renaissance humanists after Petrarch loved the idea that they were reviving something glorious. It flatters you. It's like saying history peaked, then everyone's terrible until I showed up. Then comes the Reformation and religious conflict. Catholics, Protestants, everyone writing pamphlets like it's medieval Twitter. Different groups start using medieval as a punching bag. Some Protestants paint the Middle Ages as an era of superstition and corruption to criticize the medieval church. Later, Enlightenment thinkers who were obsessed with reason look back at the medieval institutions and go, ah yes, the time before everyone became enlightened, like me. And then you get historians like Edward Gibbon in the 18th century, whose Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire basically frames the post-Roman world as a tragic collapse into barbarism. And he's not shy about blaming religion as part of that story. The Dark Ages becomes the ultimate diss track, 1,000 years summarized as nothing good happened, everyone was irrational, and then, finally, the modern age arrived. Which is convenient if you're trying to sell the modern era as the grand prize. Now here's the part where we don't swing to the other extreme and pretend early medieval life was a cozy craft fair with lute music. Because for many people, in many places, it could be brutal. The post-Roman centuries in the West were marked by fragmentation. Power becomes regional, politics becomes personal. Safety often depends on who can muster armed men. And then, like the universe piling on, there are waves of pressure. Migrations, wars, shifting borders and raids. You get groups like the Vikings later on appearing along the coast and rivers with that special brand of surprise that says, hello, we're here, this is now our silver. If you're living in a coastal monastery and you see longships on the horizon, you're not thinking, what a fascinating period of cultural exchange. You're thinking, why is my entire life suddenly on fire? And disease doesn't exactly help. There are outbreaks like the Justinianic plague in late antiquity, early medieval centuries, and later the Black Death in the 14th century, though that's outside the classic early Dark Ages label. But it still shapes how people imagine the whole medieval period as a non-stop misery compilation. So yes, parts of this era include instability, violence, and real hardship. But here's the trick. Hardship doesn't mean nothing else is happening. In fact, some of the most important transformations in European history happened because the Roman system broke apart. Now let's tackle a few cliches. Because the Dark Ages have been given the PR of a villain in a children's cartoon. Myth number 1. Everyone thought the earth was flat. Nope. Educated people in medieval Europe generally knew the earth was a sphere. That idea goes way back to antiquity and survives. The flat earth Middle Ages thing is mostly a much later myth, ironically spread in the modern era by people who wanted the Middle Ages to look dumb. Myth number 2. Nobody learned anything. Also no. Learning changes shape, it moves into monasteries, cathedral schools, later universities. It's not gone, it's reorganized. And myth number 3. Everyone was filthy and never bathed. Look, standards vary and medieval cities had plenty of problems, but the idea that everyone just embraced being a swamp creature is exaggerated. The point is, Dark Ages became a bucket for every insult later eras wanted to throw backwards in time. But if we actually look, we find light, sometimes literally, in the glow of ink on parchment. Okay now, so picture a cold room, stone walls, winter, a monk hunched over a desk, copying a text by hand. Every letter deliberate, every mistake costly. This isn't glamorous, it's not a Marvel movie, but it's one of the reasons you can read ancient literature at all. Monasteries become key centres of literacy in parts of Western Europe. They copy religious works, yes, but also grammar, philosophy, history, sometimes even classical authors. They preserve, organise and transmit knowledge in an era where fewer institutions can. And then you get moments like the Carolingian Renaissance in the late 8th and 9th centuries, when Charlemagne's court deliberately promotes learning, standardizes writing, encourages schools, and draws scholars like Alcuin of York. That's not everyone forgot how to think, that's a conscious effort to rebuild intellectual infrastructure. It's not a straight line, it's uneven, but it's real. And while Western Europe is rebuilding in its own way, the wider world is very much not sitting in the dark. And here's a massive point that often gets left out. Even in parts of Western Europe have fewer written sources and less urban complexity than Rome, other regions were thriving intellectually and economically. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, keeps Roman administration going for centuries. Constantinople is a powerhouse. And across the Islamic world you have enormous scholarly activity. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, along with major cities and libraries. Knowledge moves, translations happen, ideas travel. Later, a lot of classical learning re-enters Latin Europe through contact and translation. Spain, Sicily, trade routes, diplomacy, conquest. History is messy and interconnected, so calling the whole period the Dark Ages is like walking into a bustling pub, standing in the corner where the light bulb's flickering and announcing, "Gentlemen, the entire building is darkness." No mate, you're just in a dodgy corner. So if historians today are skeptical of Dark Ages, why does the term still live in our brains rent-free? Because it's useful, it's a neat narrative. Rome falls, then everything becomes bad until the Renaissance saves the day. It fits in a school lesson, it fits in a documentary trailer. It makes modern people feel like they're standing on top of history looking down at the before times, like, wow, imagine not having Wi-Fi. And the term gets baked into popular culture, movies, fantasy, even the way we talk. Dark Ages becomes shorthand for backwards, regardless of what was actually happening. Plus, remember that other definition. The early medieval period in parts of Western Europe genuinely has fewer surviving sources than Rome, so historians for a long time treated it as a frustrating gap, an era harder to see. But harder to see turned into nothing worth seeing, and that's the sleight of hand. If you zoom out, the early Middle Ages aren't a void, they're a transition. Rome's Western system breaks apart, yes, but new kingdoms form, new identities grow, new languages evolve. Christianity reshapes institutions, local power networks replace imperial administration, agriculture changes, technology changes, warfare changes, art changes. And by the time you hit the High Middle Ages, roughly 1000 CE onwards, you get explosive growth. Towns expanding, trade networks intensifying, universities emerging, cathedrals rising like stone forests, legal systems developing, philosophers arguing with enough intensity to power a small city. That doesn't mean it's all progress and sunshine. The medieval world contains brutality and inequality and war and famine. But that's human history, that's every era including ours. So the better way to see it is the Dark Ages aren't the lights going out, it's the room being rearranged. It's messier, it's less documented in place, but it's not empty. So why were the Middle Ages called the Dark Ages? Partly because for some regions and centuries, historians had fewer sources so it felt like a fog. Partly because the Roman world really did fracture in the West and life could become harsher and more local, but mostly because later people needed a contrast. Petrarch in the Renaissance wanted a dramatic rebirth. Enlightenment thinkers wanted a story where reason triumphs over superstition. Reformers wanted an era to blame for religious corruption. And modern people love a simple villain, the past. The label tells you more about the people who invented it than the people who lived it. And that's the real curiosity, isn't it? Because history isn't just what happened, it's also the stories we tell about what happened and why. The Dark Ages might not be an era without light, but an era standing in the shadow of everyone who came later and said, look how bright we are. If you enjoyed this little time travel, hit like and subscribe to The Curiosity Diary for more stories about the strange, brilliant and misunderstood people who built our world. And I'll see you in the next one.